Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too. I think I'm in the wrong chair.
Uh-oh. Well, welcome to everybody here and everybody home watching to the Tuesday, February 11th informational meeting. We'll call this meeting to order and start out with committee reports. We have one for the Siouxland Heritage Museum Board and Councilor Starr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Museum Board is rolling along, and one of the most exciting things that came out of the meeting this week is talking about the Mountain Plains Museum Board that is a regional group of 13 states. That group, which the Old Courthouse Museum is a member of, will be meeting in Sioux Falls in September, actually just before Labor Day weekend. So we will be the spotlight of the museums and facilities in the region as part of their regional conference. So with that, there are programming and things that normally go on with the Old Courthouse Museum that are moving along, and the board's actually in good shape and actually getting things unpacked, and they continue to find new things in the Old Courthouse Museum as space becomes available, as things are moved to the new Irene Hall research facility. So they found things that they know they have and have been cataloged but haven't seen them for a while. So it's kind of fun, and they're adding some gallery space as well as part of the process as things are moved to the archive. So it's been, having the archive building has been just a very important part to the facility, not only the bones of holding the thing together and the extra weight in some of the upper floors to get that out of the building, but to also have more opportunity for people to use the items that are in the collection. So things are rolling along with the Old Courthouse Museum as well as the Pettigrew. So
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
Councilor. Glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
And we will open it up for City Council open discussion. Councilor Erickson.
Thank you. I'll just make a quick mention that we had our Municipal League Board meeting in Pierre last week, along with the rib dinner that I believe there's 5 of us, as well as some city staff that also attended the rib dinner. It was very well attended by legislators as well as other municipalities throughout the state. Our board meeting was very brief. We talked about several of the bills that we are tracking as a league, and you continue to get those updates as counselors from Yvonne Taylor, our executive director. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor. Anybody else? Councilor Staley.
First of all, I was able to attend the Faith Temple food giveaway on Friday, and they said that last year our mayor was there. I would encourage every council member to attend this. It's every Friday at the fairgrounds, and they serve 500 to 600 people. Anyone can go through their line. They're getting their food from Feeding South Dakota. They have to pay $2,000 to facilitate this every Friday. And they indicated, and I knew that before, that a person is limited to how many times they can go to the food pantry and pick up groceries. So, but this is an every Friday thing. And 500 to 600 people, they have 70 volunteers that help with this. I was very impressed. I helped while I was out there. And they said that the 211 helpline has directed thousands of people to their service on this Friday giveaway. So I encourage any of you, if you want to contact Pastor Jeff Hayes at the Faith Temple Church, and go out there to see firsthand what they're doing to help the working poor. These are not homeless people. These are working poor, food jeopardized people. There were children there, and they had meat, they had oranges, potatoes, eggs, staples that people need. And it's a huge support for our community. It shows the other part of Sioux Falls. A lot of, I don't want to be preachy here, but many times we see the glittering parts, the development, the beautiful parts. You go out there, you're going to see the reality of how people are living on the other side of the tracks in our town. So we need to be putting energy towards both of those entities. The second thing I wanted to say is we've all been hearing about the coronavirus that's happening in China, and I'm getting bits and pieces on the internet that the state is addressing it. We've heard a little from our city about the health department talking about it. And so I made an official request with our leadership today that we get the health department in to give us a briefing about what they think could happen in South Dakota. Maybe it's nothing. But if we would have an epidemic hit our city, what measures are we going to be taking to help people? And I know that would be in conjunction with the hospital, but within our health department, we're so proactive about educating people. And what comes to mind is the West Nile virus. I was down in Baton Rouge years ago, and they were very much into prevention of West Nile. We hadn't even talked about it here. And I came back from that trip to Baton Rouge. I said, gee, maybe we need to be kind of educating people about mosquito control. And I hate to say it, but the health department just kind of brushed me aside at that time. Look how things have changed as time has gone on. Now we're spraying for it. So I just think it would be good to have that discussion with our health department. So wanted to publicly state that I was putting that out there. Thank you.
Anybody else? Since you did bring it up, I did actually, upon reviewing emails just before starting, Director Franken did send me a little bit of an update to share with folks today. With regard to the 2019 coronavirus in the United States, the important thing to remember there remains no confirmed cases in South Dakota. Only 13 cases have been identified in the United States. Most recent diagnosed case was in 2/6 of 2020, no deaths associated in those 12 cases. With no vaccine to prevent illness, the goal of public health is to detect new cases quickly and prevent further transmission. Sioux Falls Health Department continues to partner with local, state, and federal partners to monitor the situation, in particular with the South Dakota Department of Health, to ensure good communication with this changing situation. So she sent this just recently to have me share with the folks here tonight, so I'm sure they're following up and will continue to. Okay, we'll move into our presentations for the day. The first one will be our sales tax update with Director Pritchett. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Council. Sean Pritchett with the Finance Department. We have several topics that we kind of have included into this one presentation today. And the first one being a sales tax update for 2019. We have now closed out the year, completed the end of 2019, and can start providing a big picture view of where sales taxes landed for the city, since that's an important component of our revenue sources for the city of Sioux Falls. The second thing we're going to be talking about is an available balance in the sales and use tax capital fund, and brief you on the proposal for supplementing the budget by $6.125 million for capital projects to move forward with in 2020. So we'll be providing a briefing to you on that. There will be further discussion in regard to that topic this evening as that comes forward. And then finally, just also provide a brief update to you on the upcoming bond proposal, which will be brought forward to the council here later in 2020 as well. Big picture in regard to municipal taxes for the city of Sioux Falls. So as we look at the state reports in terms of where we landed for 2019, total taxable sales in the city of Sioux Falls were $6.8 billion. That's about a $431 million increase over what we saw in 2018, or about a 6.7% growth. And that equates very closely to our growth in our receipts that we've seen. We're going to get to that here in a slide further in this presentation, but we saw about a 6.6% increase in total sales taxes collected by this city. Wanted to talk to you about some of the major areas that are laid out in terms of taxable sales and what we see happening over the course of 2019 versus 2018. These are not all of the major areas, but these are the ones where we saw the most significant changes. So if you look at on a percentage of growth basis, the areas that actually saw the largest growth were agriculture, manufacturing, and wholesale trade. So on a percentage basis, those increased the most, although they may not be the largest in total dollar amount. If you look at total dollar amount of where the increases of taxable sales occurred, the two primary areas are retail trade, which grew at $198 million in 2019, as well as services, which grew $92 million. So collectively, they comprised about 2/3 of the total increase in taxable sales that we saw in our community here over the last year. I want to take a look at that retail sales portion a little bit more closely because it did factor in so largely in the growth of our sales, and there are a multitude of areas that the categories they break them down to, and then there's even further subcategories below that. But in 2019, we saw moderate increases in general merchandise, food stores, automotive, and eating and drinking establishments. There was minor reductions in building materials, apparel, as well as home furniture. Of the $198 million, if you look off to the right there, you can see a dramatic change in miscellaneous retail. That area grew by about $135 million, or about a 23% increase over the prior year. If you look further into that category, and I don't have a slide showing this, but there are a multitude of subfactors within that. But one of those subfactors is catalog and mail order houses, which grew 124 million. So if you see that whole category went up 135, 124 of that was represented by catalog and mail order houses. Now that appears to be where the state is cataloging a lot of the remote sales taxes that we've talked a lot about that are coming in. We've talked to the state about this. They say that's not the only category that's being categorized in. But I talked to the Secretary of the Department of Revenue last week, in fact, and we still do not have definitive numbers on actual remote access sales taxes at a municipal level yet. And they have not released that information, and he said they don't expect to release it or have it available for another couple of months yet, and we've been expecting it. So at this point, the best we can glean is from the general information that is out there, and to make some general estimates that's kind of what we see occurring here. If you look at that, then what we've seen for sales taxes coming into that, one could probably extrapolate that perhaps 1/3 of the increase in sales tax revenues we saw last year were a result of remote sales taxes being collected. Now, you have to take that into consideration to the fact that there's a lot of shifting going on between these categories as well. So if we think about remote sales taxes, one could think that we're growing or expanding the size of our sales tax base, and certainly there's a degree of truth to that, but also we have to estimate that there is behavioral changes occurring. I know there are in my personal life as we buy more from Amazon as opposed to maybe some of our big box retailers. And so with that, you actually see a movement happening between, say, general merchandise and apparel to miscellaneous retail where it's getting categorized now. So some of it is expansion of the tax base. Really, it is preservation of the tax base by ensuring that we maintain our taxability, and this is certainly an important component of what happened with the Wayfair case. The other point, key point I want to drive forward here is we saw that big increase and the impact of that increase occurring in 2019, but that impact isn't expected to continue going into 2020. And what I say, it's not that we're not going to collect remote sellers, but we've taken maybe that 2% bump occurring in 2019 to grow beyond that and have expectations for, say, another 6%, of which 2% was driven by that remote sellers as a potential new expanded revenue source. We just have to reset our expectations as to what's reasonable to assume going forward into 2020. So we did have a good year in terms of sales taxes for this year, but we just always have to be cognizant of where we set our expectations going forward. This graph is one we have shown in the past. I want to revisit it here a little bit, but this takes a look at the sales tax growth over the past 15 years. And you'll see the trailing 12-month average is shown in the red dotted line above. You can certainly see the impact of what we had from the 2008-2009 recession, where we actually saw negative growth in our sales tax. And you also see a dip occurring in that 2017-2018 area, which we're aware of. We really had reductions and slow growth in terms of our sales tax growth. What could have been happening there is that ag sector, some of the challenges that we've been seeing there, baking in a little bit to the numbers. But we have seen some steady growth since then, so we have been on the upward trend. Some of the key concerns or headwinds that we are cognizant of going into 2020 and 2021 that we do want to continue to remind ourselves of. One is the loss of the sales taxes on internet services. So your cable bills that might include internet services, your cell phone bills that might have data services. In the middle of this next year will not, or this current year will not be available or be open to having sales taxes applied to it. That was a federal decision. It was not a local decision, so one that we're just incumbent upon. But the state estimates they're going to lose $20 million as a result of that change. Their estimate for municipalities is $8 to $10 million, which I think is fair. We were estimating maybe $1.5 million for the city of Sioux Falls, maybe upwards of $2 million of a loss in sales tax reductions. So we're very cognizant that that's going to partially impact us this year in 2020. We're going to see the full impact of that loss of revenue in 2021. The second thing we're continuing to watch is the impact of the ag economy. On a statewide basis, and even in terms of our local economy, we've benefited from the transfer payments that occurred from the federal government as a result of some of the trade wars that were occurring, that came to help bolster, that did help bolster our ag economy in the past year. If that does not continue, with those trade wars kind of being reduced in terms of coverage or what's occurring overseas. If weather doesn't improve, we continue to have low commodity prices. We need to be cognizant that we could see some downward pressure from ag. Certainly we are diversified, but it is a possibility of some impact there as well. We need to be cognizant of the economic stress points and some of the things that we've seen occurring in the economy. Transportation has seen major reductions nationwide in terms of freight and so forth. That's usually a leading indicator of something that's going on with the economy and some slowdowns that could be occurring. The inverted yield curve that people have talked a lot about, but have since kind of stopped discussing, is usually a leading indicator of something of an economic slowdown, so we need to be cognizant and aware of that, as well as the federal elections that are upcoming. Whether it's perceived or real, they can have a real impact in terms of our economy and overall for Wall Street and so forth, so we have to be cognizant of the impact those perceptions would have for us locally as well. So those are just some of the headwinds that we continue to be cognizant of as we look forward into 2020 and 2021. We've also shared this graph before, but it's important to continue to reiterate this. This is our 10-year average for sales tax growth in a given year, and then a 10-year trailing average as well. And what this really shows is that decrease that we've seen over time, over the last 20 years of sales taxes in terms of percentage growth. We have been on a downward trend. We appear to have somewhat stabilized at this point. We've seen a positive 2019, which is good to see, but long gone are the days where we typically saw an 8 or 9% growth in a given year that we did perhaps 10, 15 years ago. This is the chart for our sales tax receipts for 2019. You can see that we ended the year in a real strong position. December was like the previous months. We ended up 9.2% up in December for 2019 versus December of 2018. We haven't done a monthly report for December yet because we're still closing the books, so wanted to bring this forward as we have the discussions here today. And overall for the year, we did see a 6.6% sales tax growth for the year in its entirety. Second topic we're going to talk about today is the sales and use tax. Given the growth in the sales taxes over the 2019, this does afford us an opportunity to look at some additional investments on the capital infrastructure in 2020 based on the carry forward available balance that we see. We talk a lot about the different buckets that we have in terms of our city funds. It's an easy way to kind of simplify what tends to be a fairly complex bucket, or a complex budget. Maybe it's a giant bucket too. But you can see we have different buckets here, and the general fund is the one we talk about the most. It's the largest fund that we have, and that funds our operations. The one that we're going to be talking about more today is the sales tax fund, and we're going to be spending some time talking about what the impacts have been from 2019 on the sales tax fund. So it might be easier to refer to it as the capital fund because it is the fund that we utilize to pay for capital and infrastructure projects as well as long-term equipment. It is funded by the second penny sales tax. It does not include property taxes as part of this particular fund. So it is driven by the sales taxes, and it is driven specifically for infrastructure projects. So it does not fund things like operations for the city. It does not fund maintenance type things like filling potholes or snow removal, or maintenance of our parks or city salaries. It is strictly for those major road reconstruction projects, bricks and mortar, and so forth. We did have a sizable increase in the available balance at the end of the year. So I wanted to talk about where that came from, because it came from a multitude of sources. Given the positive news that we've had in terms of the sales taxes, one would want to take the perspective maybe that it was driven entirely by the increase in sales taxes that we've had. Certainly that played a part, but only about 40% of the available balance that was generated at the 2019 was actually a result of our increase in sales taxes. So we had budgeted a certain increase, but sales taxes came in and added to the available balance by about $3.3 million. So again, about 40% of that available balance that we're seeing is coming from that. Other areas where we're seeing the available balance come from, the second largest one is $1.6 million, and this relates to a one-time cash flow adjustment due to timing of debt service and bond reserves. So we did 2018, we did a bond refinancing. It changed the amount that we had to be putting into the trust, and the timing of that, it resulted in a one-time cash flow adjustment where we could bring that back in and make that part of our available balance. It's available for obligations there. $800,000 was turned back from projects that were either came in under budget or were deobligated and not moved forward for a variety of reasons. So $800,000 came back and available to the fund as a result of those changes. $300,000 approximately was left over from 2018. If you recall, we kind of obligated certain amounts throughout the year, but we never fully obligated the fund, so we had $300,000 left forward. That continues to roll forward as well. We have $400,000 in what we call miscellaneous others, contributions, releases from restrictions, RZ bond interest. We get refunded from the federal government for some bonds that we did during the Great Recession. So that was a program that they had developed at that point, so they make a refund payment to us. So those are all a part of that. And then we had about $900,000 that came in from interest. So we have two major areas where we collect interest income for this fund. The first being that we hold a certain amount of funds in trust for our bonds. It's required as part of our bond loan documents. That's held at U.S. Bank, and that will accrue interest and earnings during that period where it's held with them, and that needs to be accounted for. The second is the pooled cash. So we have a certain amount of cash for this fund, which is pooled with all of our funds. But for this fund, before it's dispersed, it sits, if we have cash flow, it'll sit there, continue to be invested, and it will generate interest income. So collectively, between those two, it generated about $900,000 of interest income, which added to our available balance. And the last one, and perhaps the most challenging sometimes to explain, is the $800,000 increase in what we call mark-to-market. So when I talk about those trust funds and we talk about that pooled cash, we hold those in certain types of investments. Now, statutorily, we can only make certain types of investments that are very low risk, but can provide some minimal return to the city while we hold that cash. One of the main areas is we hold certificates of deposit with banks, and those are fully collateralized certificates of deposits, but that's probably a smaller portion. A larger portion of our cash and reserves is held in U.S. Treasury bonds, or Treasury securities, and we hold them in various lengths, whether it's 3 months, 90 days, 3 years, 1 year. It just depends on what we project our cash flow needs are going to be, and then we continue to invest them over time so we get some sort of return for the city of Sioux Falls. But what happens from an accounting perspective is that we have to mark those securities as if we sold them basically on December 31st of the year. So even though we will always hold those securities until they mature, those valuations of those securities will fluctuate during the year. So investment 101, if interest rates go down, the value of your bond is your price of your bond, if you were to sell it, is going to go up. And the inverse is true. So what we see happening in 2019 is we see a reduction of interest rates over time, and we saw the value of our pooled investments increase. We have to book that. It might not truly be true cash for us, but from an available balance perspective, on paper, it's something that we show as part of our available balance. So this year we ended up on the positive side of that with that increase. In another year, if interest rates were to go up, we could see a reduction of that. And that is one risk that we're going to talk about in terms of a reserve fund for the sales and use tax, is if interest rates go up and we have to mark down those securities in a given year. Again, we're going to hold them to maturity, so it's not going to impact us from a cash perspective long term. But in that particular year, we might have to take a reduction. If we don't have a place to reduce against, then we have to start deobligating projects. that we already obligated if we have a fully obligated sales and use tax fund. So I can revisit that a little bit more if we have questions, but that's generally what happens and is going to kind of lead us into the discussion in terms of our reserve. So when we think about reserve funds for the city, we typically think about our general fund reserve because we reserve for operations. We have a policy to try to maintain a 25% balance in that reserve at all times, and we project outwards to try to meet that 25% threshold. We have kept a small reserve within the sales and use tax fund to hedge against those market fluctuations that we were talking about in terms of mark to market, and it was about $700,000. And you will see this in your previous monthly reports. We are proposing, given the available balance that we have for this year, that it would be prudent and fiscally responsible for us to consider upping that reserve as a hedge against the headwinds that we talked about that are coming forward at us, particularly over the next several years as we look to see what is going to be happening from an economics perspective. I'm going to flip ahead to this slide and just talk a little bit about this, but these were kind of the reasoning. So what we're proposing is to take about $1.7 million of that available balance and push it through to the reserve and recognize it and designate it as reserve funds for the sales and use tax fund. Again, it's a hedge against market trends. We need to be prepared for weather-related events, which I think 2019 taught us well to recognize and also to appreciate possibilities going forward. You have to recognize concerns about market forces and disruptions, which could reduce revenues and our capacity to fund projects over time. So this provides us an opportunity to balance that, provides us an opportunity not to hold back on our investments in future years should sales taxes not meet our expectations, and take advantage of opportunities at the most prime moment. When we start going into an economic slowdown, one of the best things we can do is take advantage of a potentially lower price environment, as well as take an opportunity to invest in the community in terms of jobs and development and construction at a time when things might not be as good. So it does provide a good opportunity. It's not huge, but it does provide some of that little bit of a cushion to allow us to manage through those particular those situations. Essentially what we're asking is about 20% of that available balance to be moved forward into that reserve fund. One of the things you may ask is kind of how we came about the $1.7 million. Where we came forward with the proposal for this is one, that mark-to-market adjustment. You know, not real true cash, but it's a kind of accounting entry. It just makes sense that that would be designated over to a reserve fund to hedge against the contrary positioning in future years. But we want to take it a step further and say, let's take the interest income that we earned this year as well, the $900,000, and put that into a reserve as well to help hedge against those economic forces and those headwinds that we may be looking toward. With that change, and we go back to the slide here, that leaves us with approximately $6.5 million that could be potentially invested in additional infrastructure projects that we're going to talk about further here this afternoon. The one thing I would say is these are preliminary numbers. We'll be coming to you with the audit likely in the end of March and with our financial presentation at the beginning of April, and those will have our final numbers and our final presentation. We're confident in the balance below there, but recognize that there could be some small adjustments as payables are coming in that shifts some between the categories above there, but we are comfortable with the $6.5 million that we are proposing there. Talking a little bit about some of the proposed capital projects that we're bringing forward. I want to talk to you a little bit about the process that we kind of went through to decipher what proposals to bring forward to you for consideration. One of the things that I want to say is we're continually listening to the public. We get, just as yourselves, certainly, we get a lot of people that reach out through social media, through email and so forth, and provide a basis for kind of what's going on and what people are seeing as needs out in the community. We have been listening to you as counselors at various meetings. We're going to talk about the fire station today. I distinctly recall when we had the budget presentation and we were talking about pulling the fire station out of the capital program and instead funding it with bond funds instead of with cash. There was some conversation at the dais here about that, and as well as some conversation that we need to be thinking strategically about that if we have the available balance at the end of 2019 to fund that with cash if available. So you're going to see that coming forward. There's also been conversations here at the dais about the Great Bear Chairlift, about potential needs for additional funding for that, particularly over the last couple of weeks. That has been recognized and incorporated in some of the things that we're going to be bringing forward to you as well. The other piece that I want to talk about is just philosophically how we look at the budgeting process from an administrative standpoint. Both listening to the council, but also working with departments on a holistic approach to budgeting, as well as how we determine what priorities are priorities for the city, or what are the highest priority needs for the city. And as part of that, really not just this not being a one-on-one between, say, a department and the mayor, but really departments sitting down together to recognize what the needs are across the city, weighing them against each other, and then bringing forward to you a consensus and unified viewpoint of what those needs really are, and standing and talking with that unified voice. The other big piece of this is timeliness. We want to make sure these are shovel ready. We want to make sure these are ones that we can have an impact on in 2020, so not projects that will be deferred and not go to construction until 2021. So we want to make sure that we are bringing forward these projects that can make a strong impact this year. And it's kind of setting up, we did talk about in the budget process, we kind of brought through this idea of the Maslow hierarchy and needs and tried to apply it to city and how we look at the needs for the city. And we talked kind of what that base infrastructure was, that base from which we grow from. If we don't have good infrastructure, we have no base to grow from as a community. Each one of these pieces is going to be encompassed in the proposal that we're bringing forward to you for consideration. The first one, infrastructure, we're asking for a $1.7 million investment in highways and streets to continue our commitment to that, to improve the quality of our streets in our community. Safety and health is certainly a big piece of the underlying values for our community as well. And a big piece of this will be the $3.3 million request that we're bringing forward to fund the fire station from cash, rather than putting it into the upcoming bond. And then finally, on the higher end is livability, this idea of quality of life. We're coming forward with the $1.125 million request for Parks and Recreation in this area of livability in terms of the Great Bear Chairlift, as well as some improvements to Terrace Park that are important from a historical aspect to our community, as well as culture. So I kind of walked through each of the pieces that we're going to kind of ask each of the directors to come through and walk through in more detail with you about what each of these investments would mean. This would be $6.125 million. Even with this, that leaves about $350,000 that's unobligated based on our projection for the final available balance in this fund. The nice thing about having some left over like we had last year is it will also put us in a position to absorb some costs should we have another weather-related event. If you recall, later in the year we had to come back and ask for supplemental funding on the capital side to deal with some of the flooding and tornado issues, primarily on the flooding side, I think was more capital related. Even if we're getting reimbursed from FEMA, we have 15 to 20% that we have to commit to that. Having a small balance remaining left over does provide an opportunity to do that without having to look at unencumbering other projects. So that's one of the reasons you see a remaining balance even after the requests that are coming forward to you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Cotter, and he's going to walk through some of the highway and street investments that we're proposing coming forward.
Thank you, Council. Thank you, Council. Good afternoon, and thank you, Sean. Great way to frame this up. I'll start off and share with you our recommendation for the investments in highways and streets. So I know we've talked in the past that the street system is the city's largest investment and approaches $1 billion. We already have a very good program lined up for this year, and this additional investment will allow us to make an even larger impact. As we look at how we've split this up, we've got the 41st Street project. That section is in similar condition to what we had last year between Western and Kiwanis. We were able to mill and overlay that section. We have a video of that we can show. We also, the timeliness of this project between Minnesota Avenue and Western, this summer we'll reconstruct 41st and Western. That's about a $4.4 million intersection project that's already been bid. And we'll also be adding a right turn lane at Minnesota and 41st Street. And so those two projects that are already planned really bookmark. And then if we can do this under reduced traffic. That'll really allow us to re-baseline that entire section of 41st Street. Our pothole patching crews are doing significant amount of work on this section of 41st Street, and it'll be a timely investment. The $200,000 for additional slurry seal. Some of the initial information we've gotten back from our pavement management survey, which we should have the full report by about early March, is to do further investments into slurry seal. We already were doing about 400 blocks this year. This would allow us to take that up to 480 blocks. And then we are also doing a Techcrete project downtown. Got a lot of stress on downtown concrete with trying to not only create good, safe streets for driving public, but there's so much pedestrian traffic down there. Almost every street in the wintertime is on a salt and sanding route. And so this additional Techcrete will allow us to kind of do that more permanent patching in the downtown area and expand our current project. All right, what that means in terms of blocks is there'll be 11 blocks of 41st Street, 5 lanes wide, milled and overlaid. The nice part about this project is we already have all the ADA ramps upgraded, and so this is a true shovel-ready project. We were preparing for this project, and this additional investment will allow us to do that. The 80 additional slurry seals, as we've talked, will allow us to expand up to 480 blocks, and then the additional 25,000 pounds, that's how we pay a contractor to put Techcrete down. It's a bag material, it gets put into a hopper. You'll see a video of that as well, but we pay them by the pound, and that's why it's the additional investment. You'll get another 25,000 pounds of that material put down. All right, there's no better way to show a project than with a drone video, and so you'll start to see this section of 41st Street. You almost see every joint is faulted through that existing asphalt pavement. This segment of 41st Street was first overlaid back in 2011. We've been fortunate to get 9 years out of it. If we could have, in a perfect timing, probably could have done it last year with the rate of degradation that's going down. We did do some kind of triage last year, but with the 2 projects again, with us reconstructing 41st and Western this summer, and then also adding the right turn lane down by Staples, those 2 projects really bookmark us to be able to go in there and do this timely mill and overlay. All right, this just shows you a snapshot of the project last year between Kiwanis Avenue and Western Avenue. We typically do these under open traffic. We just reduce the lanes so we can have the contractor work on half the project at one time. Mill the surface so we can kind of reprofile the street. And then you'll see that this is a 2-lift system. There was first a leveling course done by a local contractor, and then ultimately the top wear course was put on. We'd expect that this type of an investment will add an additional 9 years of life to that section of 41st Street between Western and Minnesota. All right, the next investment we're asking for your support on is to increase our slurry seal program. This is a proprietary product, and we switched to this several years ago so we could get away from the chip seal. This is just a typical neighborhood improvement that's happening here. Again, we normally do about 400 blocks, so this additional investment will allow us to increase it up to 480. Got great feedback from the neighborhoods on slurry seal, but it really allows for timely investment to good streets so we can reseal them up and get an additional 5 to 10 years of life before we have to do anything substantial, okay? And then last is Techcrete. This is a very labor-intensive project. We normally do outsource this with the amount of prep and placement people that are involved. We do have the equipment ourselves to do some more strategic triage work, but we've had really good luck kind of bringing more contractors on board, and it becomes a more longer lasting patch, and so we're not out there putting asphalt in some of these spalled joints, and have had really good luck with Techcrete that I know we've talked about over time. All right, now I'd like to turn it over to Don Kearney with Parks and Rec. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Don Kearney with Parks and Rec. Our supplemental appropriation is for two projects in a couple of our flagship parks. We have $800,000 identified for Great Bear, and then we have $325,000 for the pergola structures in Terrace Park, as well as the Lion's Den in Terrace Park. And the thing I'd share with you is that as we talked about placing another $800,000 towards the chairlift project, we did reach out to Great Bear and ask them if we were to put in an additional $800,000 towards the project, would they commit to $200,000 towards the project to put the funding in place to be able to actually deliver that project and get the chairlift replaced. I'm happy to share that they did agree to commit to that, and so we're appreciative of their efforts to commit to that $200,000. The chairlift in and of itself has really reached the end of its useful life. It's one of the few remaining in the country that are of that model. Unfortunately, in our case, the chairlift manufacturer, shortly after it was installed, went out of business, and since that time, we've been maintaining a chairlift through finding parts anywhere we can potentially find them, as well as having custom-made parts to be able to keep the system operational. Hats off to our mechanic, Pete Laerdal, that does a great job maintaining that for us. But it is tired, and we do want to have it replaced. Some of the benefits of a new chairlift obviously are, having parts and technical support available from a current vendor that can supply those to us. Updating the safety and convenience. Obviously, the new features that come with a new lift are much appreciated. One of the big things for this new chairlift will be better loading and unloading. It's a bit difficult with our current lift. Especially younger kids that are trying to use it, especially if you throw into the factor of people with disabilities. This lift will be much better suited to accommodate those age groups and those demographics. And the other thing that we would share with you is that we certainly will benefit from reduced lines and wait times, so our guests can really spend more time skiing and less time standing in line. We had Snow Engineering help us a while back on a master plan for Great Bear, and one of the things that their takeaway was, welcome to Great Bear, where essentially, where does the line start, so to speak. So it is a challenge for us, and it just moving people up and down the hill a lot better. There's better transitions in and out of the lift, and it'll be overall a great thing for our users, and hopefully increase memberships and drive revenue and all the other good things that come with that. Also wanted to share a current picture of the lift that we have now. It was installed in 1981. It's a Borvig lift, and again, there are very few left of those lifts and in operation, not only in the United States, but in the world. This is a picture of what a lift might look like. There's multiple manufacturers out there that provide lifts, but this is giving a visual of what maybe a new lift would look like. Not necessarily this particular vendor because we haven't bid it out yet, but did want to provide a visual of that. So on to Terrace Park. We have $325,000 targeted for those two projects, and the Lion's Den and the pergolas in the Japanese gardens are two things that, because they're 100+ years old, it's time where we need to be able to restore those in a historic fashion. In the case of the Lion's Den, as many of you probably know by now, back in the 50s and 60s, the zoo used to use it as winter holding for the lions, and so that's why we call it the Lion's Den, but it's actually a remnant of the Phillips house that used to be in Terrace Park when we acquired that back in 1916. This project would tuck point the facade, replace the missing stone, and stabilize the structure, including the doors and windows that are in that building. The pergolas, on the other hand, would receive structural improvements to the columns and beams, tuck pointing on the seat walls, and our goal is to try to reuse as much of the stone that makes up those pergolas as possible. And I have some pictures of the Lion's Den. As you can see on the right side of the picture where there's some cobblestone that is missing. We also have a larger cobblestone that's missing. And then on the pergolas themselves, we've had a mason come in and try to shore up some of those pergolas. The stone is falling off the pergolas, and so we've had a mason come back in, and you can see those where the white aggregate was put on to try to hold those things in place. We've had them also remove any of the other loose stone to make sure it didn't fall on anybody. But the key here is they're tired and they need to be replaced. And we've had improvements in Terrace Park identified in our capital plan for some time, and we really feel like advancing these two projects will really be helpful to Terrace Park, realizing that ultimately we have other improvements we'd like to make in Terrace Park as part of our overall master plan. With us today is Dan Greider and Steve Sanford from the Great Bear Board. They're here to be able to answer any questions you might have about the lift, and then our staff are available as well about any improvements to Terrace Park. So with that, I turn it over to Chief Goodroad to talk about the fire station.
Thank you, Director Kearney. Good afternoon, councilors. Fire Chief Brad Goodroad here. Talk about the impact and importance that Station 12 has in this plan. Paying cash for the station allows us to stay on track for construction to begin in 2020 and to be completed in the station opening in May of 2021. We are planning to budget for 15 new firefighters to begin their cadet academy in January of 2021 with a graduation of May of 2021 to provide staffing for that fire station. We are expecting an ISO site visit about the same time, and having the station constructed and staffed should allow us to maintain that ISO 1 rating. Keeping the station on track is also necessary to maintain our response time to priority calls in the Station 12 response area in the southeast part of Sioux Falls. And we also note that we are saving close to $1 million in interest expenses by paying for this station now instead of having it in the bond. Here you can see the growth that has occurred at Station 12's response area from 2002 through today. Similar to providing infrastructure such as roads, power, water, and sewer, it is important to maintain fire and EMS coverage, and as the city grows, to provide that same level of service throughout the entire city. And here is a rendering of Station 12 as planned. Again, this is another shovel-ready project. It will fit very well into the neighborhood at 41st and Faith and provide fire and EMS coverage for this area as it continues to grow over the following years and decades to come. And now I turn it back over to Director Pritchard.
As Chief Goodroad said, the proposal would take the fire station out of the bond proposal that we've been talking with you about for quite some time. That kind of beckons the question of where we sit with the bond overall. And so I wanted to give you just a very brief update, kind of where we sit with that also. So we have been working toward that bond. We're in the development of a bond ordinance that we would bring forward. Right now we are kind of at a pause moment as we wait for the final designs to come in for the River Greenway, Phase 3, as well as for the public safety facility. We want to make sure that's a legacy project, and that paired with the PSAP, that we make sure we get it right, as it will be a significant investment for the community over the next 50 years. Those two projects, the River Greenway, the public safety facility, with the PSAP, are all kind of strategically aligned in terms of a time frame. The benefit of pulling out the fire station is it is on a much more aggressive time frame, so it will provide some relief to us in terms of the bond. But we still are on a time frame right now to hopefully bring that forward to you either in late spring of this year is kind of what we're looking at for that proposal. But it will depend on the cost estimates that come back in, and then how much time we need to kind of glean through that and then formulate the final proposal that we bring forward. We talked about how we're going to refer to this bond going forward, and so we've kind of come up with this idea of the Community Bond 2020, focused on safety, training, and quality of life. So we've had different bond names in the past: Quality of Life 1, Quality of Life 2, Lewis and Clark, and so on and so forth. So going forward, we're going to be referring to this as the Community Bond 2020. We'll provide an opportunity that if we have future bonds, say in 2023 or 2024, that we could follow suit with them as well. So with that, myself, as well as the directors and chief, are available for any questions that you have in regard to the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilors, got any questions? Councilor Sale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sean, I'll start with you. We talk about the bonds. So explain to me again, for everybody listening at home, what kind of bonds you're able to invest in.
For the city of Sioux Falls.
Correct.
So we're able to pretty much, like I said, we are able to do certificates of deposit, and then primarily what we hold is U.S. Treasuries. So they're very minimal, low risk. Your U.S. savings bonds, we go out, we have a direct access to the market, and a majority of our funds are invested in U.S. Treasuries.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, currently there's a fund that is held for the insurance of the city employees. Is the interest that is accumulated on that part of our surplus, or does that go back to that designated fund?
So we revert those interests from that pool cash on a distribution basis back to those funds.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions now for Director Kearney and Director Kearney, Sean and you have talked about shovel-ready plans, and shovel-ready would mean something that would happen immediately. The chairlift, I believe, will be put, it won't be the 2021 winter season, it would be after that. So tell me how that would be considered shovel-ready if we're almost 2 years out.
Well, the reason why there's such a long lead time is the manufacturing of the lift itself. And so those are custom made for each individual park that they go in. And so essentially what we would need to do is do an RFP for the manufacturing of the lift. And that would go out in November of this year. So we would need money to be able to do an RFP to get proposals to actually have the firms actually submit their costs for the lift. So we'd acquire the lift, and then there'd be a separate bid package that would provide all the electrical, grading, all the other infrastructure to support the actual installation of the lift, which the lift manufacturers would provide. So they basically come in with their lift. We have everything ready for them to plug into, so to speak. And then that's the reason why the lead time, why we need the money now, realizing that we've got to get through the next season of the winter recreation season. And then, you know, in May of 2020, we would actually start construction on the installation of the lift. And so that's the reason for the lead time and the need to have funds in place this year to be able to get it in place for not next year, but the following season.
I appreciate that. And I did talk to Director Kearney earlier today and said I might go out and upgrade my welder based on the cost that this is going to come in at. I would have another question about raising the money. It seems that there was an obligation, or there was $800,000 that was supposed to come from Great Bear, and you and I have talked about this. And could you explain to the council and the public why that's not happening? And I know some of the people from Great Bear are here. I'd like to hear, in August, we had heard from the administration that there were going to be $800,000 of this money coming from the Great Bear. And now here we are 6 months later, and it's not going to happen. I think everybody would like to have an explanation on that process.
Yeah, certainly can do that. I would just preface it before I probably ask Steve or Dan to come up and speak to that. We essentially challenged the Great Bear Board to see if they could come up with additional $1 million to be able to support the construction and replacement of the lift. And certainly we asked them to do that. They did make some efforts to do that and pursue that. But I certainly would want to defer to Dan and or Steve on how that turned out, how that played out, and just ask them to address that question.
Thank you. If one of you could come up, because I understand somebody made an obligation on your behalf that said that you were going to raise the $800,000, and here we are now that we're going to pick up that tab. So,
I'm Steve Sanford. I'm president of Great Bear Management. I've been involved on the board since its inception 28 and a half years ago. Have given over 28 years of volunteer time to managing Great Bear to fulfill the promise that we made to Mayor Jack White when the chairlift was acquired and it became a city facility. I'm also on, you know, first of all, our commitment when we found out it was needed was to try, all right? I'm also on the pavilion board, and if you followed the pavilion day to day in who the pavilion management is and what it does, you'll understand that the pavilion has a very sophisticated development team They're very good at what they do. And they have a board consisting of community and business leaders, and they regularly stay in contact with community donors. They're always in contact with them regularly, and like I say, have a very impressive development staff. Great Bear Management is an entirely different sort of organization. We do not consist of community leaders. We consist of people who have experience in winter sports, particularly at Great Bear, either like me, parents who raised their children at Great Bear, or people who grew up at Great Bear. We do not regularly solicit donors. We have sponsorships where people pay a small amount a year to get their name on the little DAC board we have, or on our tubes, or things like that. So we don't have regular relationships with large donors, because that's not what we do. I mean, our contract and our job says we have to make the place work, all right? When we were told that would be expected of us, we did, and of course, those of you who have, which makes, I guess, about everybody, solicited or worked on large campaigns, with that size of money, the first thing you need to do, typically, is not go try to get something $1,000 at a time. You go and you find one lead gift of a considerable size, all right? So we reached out to a few who we felt had that capacity and interest in Great Bear, all right? And made the pitch as best we could, and were turned down, all right? So once we were turned down from parties that we felt would be the candidates for lead gifts, we could see that it wasn't going to happen. And so we stayed in contact with the mayor's office on that issue. It's an inherently difficult raise. If you talk to people who advise in this business, that is raising money, they'll tell you you need to raise something that can be shown in a picture, all right? You know, you had the picture up there of the fire station, but it needs to have a kind of tangibility and of the character that appeals to people, that it's not just, I mean, it's from something, nothing to this, and I'm sorry, a piece of mechanical equipment simply doesn't attract that kind of appeal. And we found that out by asking, and I hesitate to talk about private conversations that we have with people who turned us down, but I'll tell you that is a piece of it, that it simply doesn't sell as a charitable donation. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't worthwhile. You can't see it up there, but I know it's going to be transformative, all right? It is going to change the way we work out there. It is going to change how we we're perceived, and I promise you that the people who have made up the 32,000 paid visits we've had since December 20 will be immensely grateful. And yes, I wish we could have done it. The 200,000 will handle. That's at a different level. But again, obviously I wish we could have done it, but it just wasn't in the cards for the type of organization we are and for the type of project it is. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean that we're not doing our job. It doesn't mean that the project isn't worthwhile. It just, in that context, was not to be.
Well, thank you, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Other questions? Councilor Erickson?
Just piggybacking on the chairlift concept, I'll say, for either Don or Sean, we have a lot of city-owned facilities. What's the standard of us asking those facilities to raise said funds? Do we ask SMG? Do we ask the Pavilion? Do we ask Landscapes Unlimited? What's the standard, and is this common? And I guess I support them raising the money, don't get me wrong, but for whatever reason, I thought there was something that prohibited us from going and asking for those things. So there's a handful of questions in there, I guess.
So that depends. I mean, there is requests for sponsorships and there is requests for charitable donations, right? So for us to, your one question, I guess your last question was, what can we do in terms of what we're allowed to do? So for the city to go out itself and ask for a donation, there's some ethics problems and challenges with that specifically. We can be approached about it, or we can ask another entity that we have in a management agreement, and there's nothing that prohibits them from engaging in that.
That makes sense. Like the zoo, for example, the zoo fundraises all the time for bears and monkeys, and it's nonstop to update those.
Exactly, it's part of their DNA as an organization. They're built for that.
Okay.
It's the Washington Pavilion. For SMG, it's a city-owned facility and a for-profit management entity, and it's not. Different. I think it's very fair what the gentleman said about, it's somewhat the same feedback that we've received, from that. Donors want to build something new.
Right.
Replacement is a little bit harder.
It is. No, I understand that. Thank you for clarifying that for me. The other question I have is on the Lions Den. In our 2016-2020 CIP, we did have the Lions Den rehabilitation in there and spent a significant amount of money since 2016. So talk to me a little bit about what's been done and why it didn't maintain what it did. If you want me to read the description, I can read it in the CIP book.
In 2016, you say?
2016-2020 CIP, the justification was the Upper Terrace Park Master Plan was completed recently through a series of public input meetings. The improvements identified including replacing aging infrastructure, enhancing historical aspects of the features of the park, renovating the Lions Den, lighting improvements, and creating better pedestrian circulation through the park. The renovation of the ball fields is needed to bring the dated facility to the current design standards. The major items include raising the fence heights to provide additional safety to spectators, replacing the dugouts, field realignment, grading, irrigation, and path replacement. And so in 2016, there was sales tax of $176,900. And then 43 in 2017, 458 in 2018, 101,000 in 2019, 2020 is 851,000. So I understand it's for the whole complex, But was the Lion's Den not touched at that time? Because if that's failing so badly, why did we not do that, or what was done during that time?
Yeah, the improvements that are referenced in there, that Terrace Park is inclusive of the ball fields on the other side, on the west side of the lake. And so last year we did half the ball fields and renovated those, and then we also, this current year, we're also gonna renovate the other half of those ball fields. The other thing I would tell you is that we have done stuff to the Lion's Den as far as structural stabilization of the Lion's Den. It's been probably 6 or 7 years ago that we did some work in there to stabilize the Lion's Den with some shoring, based on a structural engineer's assessment of the Lion's Den itself. Part of our challenge too is that we've deferred, and because of citywide balancing as a CIP, we've deferred improvements at Terrace Park. One, and I think last year, another year, out just because of the available funding citywide. And so specific to the question, I may have to ask for Mike or Tori to help me out with that. I don't know if they can address that. They work a little closer to that CIP than I, and maybe can answer your question.
And I know a few years ago there was some challenges, we'll say, with that park as far as what we could and couldn't do, and some pushback. And so I know it kind of all came to a screeching halt, and I don't know if that's, so the focus was on the baseball fields instead of that, or what happened?
Yeah, so the project that you're referring to in 2016, we're going to do a small centennial project, which was the first part of the master plan. We did let that project and had it awarded to a contractor. And then that's when the neighborhood came back and wanted us to talk to the local historic board. So instead of going through with that project, we canceled it and canceled our contract with the contractor. So that's the 2016 project. From that point on, we did do a project to renovate half of the ball fields in Terrace Park, but the master plan stuff was moved back due to balancing.
Okay.
So we haven't done anything with the Lion's Den other than the initial stabilization that Don was referring to.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. I have one more, and then I'll wait and ask more in a minute. Sean, if I could ask you a question about the unreserved fund balance and cash balance. As you talked about that and putting in $1.7 million into the reserve fund for that, which certainly I understand the intent behind that. As everyone knows, the City Council has a policy in place for 25% reserve of the general fund for us for rainy day, make sure that if something happens, we've got that money. Do you guys have something in mind as far as what you want to see that at? Is there a goal of, you know, getting that to a 5% hold, 10%, 15%? I mean, what is the goal behind it? I'm not saying I don't support it. I'm just trying to understand what that target is. So the expectation is there, and I mean, it's an easy pot of money to dip into if we need, if there's not a policy set beside it of what that standard should look like.
You know, optimally, like we talked about, what does 5% look like in that fund if we try to achieve toward that? And I think we're going to have to look at where we sit in future years. Like, do we continue to have robust returns of sales taxes, or are we going to have challenging years? Because it's one thing to reserve money, it's another thing to never use it, right? And for a general fund, it's a little bit different because there is a grandiose amount of responsibilities on the operational side from a city that you need to be buffering against. As opposed to on the sales tax side, we do have room to unencumber, we do have room to scale back. You have a little bit of a capacity. It's easier to deobligate a capital fund project than it is to completely downsize an entire department overnight, right? So there's the buffering mechanism, I think, in the general fund is more important. We haven't had that specific policy set forward and really haven't come forward with a proposal, but we do believe that at this point in time, giving some of the things that we're looking ahead to in the next couple of years, coming off of 10 years of straight growth, that maybe it's time that we give some consideration to this for the next couple of years to just kind of head off what could be ahead of us at this point.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it. I have a couple more questions, but I'll wait.
Councilor Neitzer.
Director Pritchett, don't go too far. Let's dig a little bit more into this reserve fund issue. Of course, you have a reserve fund, a reserve target in your operating, because that's essentially your emergency fund for a rainy day. but I'm a little, have we ever had a quote-unquote reserve in the capital fund? That seems like kind of a,
We have kept a small amount in, especially in the last couple of years, and this predates my time a little bit, but I think in talking with Tom Hewer, the assistant director, has had some conversations, especially as we start talking about hedging off those market adjustments. If we're not hedging against them, we have the capacity to have to de-obligate projects in a year that goes against us. So if you kind of refer back to like the last few monthly reports or in the last couple of years, you'll see we do have a line item that says less reserve, and it's just been kind of an amount that's been put aside to help hedge against that.
okay, so I'm pretty fiscally conservative with my finances, so I was like having some money in the bank and having a hedge. But in this particular case, help me with this balance. There's always, I mean, it's nice to have a hedge, but on the other hand, you're also sitting on idle money. And when you think about capital, most capital projects are going to be inflating pretty quickly. And so it's, you know, construction costs might go up 5-6% a year. And so we're sitting on money, and inflation is going to be chewing it up versus putting it to work and doing capital. And I have a little bit more latitude, I would think, in the capital fund where I can defer a project. I mean, I can push a road project back for a year and boom, I've saved myself $10 million or something like that. So why just sit on top of cash and essentially letting construction inflation destroy its value?
It's a fair question. I think part of it, again, I'm looking at what potentially we're going to see over the next couple of years in recognizing that we are going to see some softness potentially coming toward us and being prepared if sales taxes don't come in what we had originally projected. I wouldn't say we were aggressive in our projections, but we had, 4 and 5% out years for the capital fund. And, whether that materializes or not, we need to be prepared to hedge against. The other piece of it, and I didn't talk about this, and I meant to as part of the presentation, is a cash flow situation. So we never want to be short on cash, and the unique thing about this fund is we kind of have a reverse U-shape effect in terms of when the money goes out of this fund. So it's real heavy in January because we send our debt service payments over to the trust, and it sits in the trust, so it still shows as restricted in our actual cash, but it's not available cash for paying bills as they come in. And then we kind of have this slope time where the sales taxes are coming in. We're not expending a lot of money because the capital projects are going to construction. Then the pay requests start coming in and we start putting money out in the street and we start paying things. And so the money starts going out. And what this will help a little bit with that is from a cash flow perspective, we don't get in a negative cash position in this fund. So we keep the fund positive throughout the year. And so that's one area that we had a few concerns about, and this will help hedge against that as well.
And maybe finally, before I defer, if we are going to go down this road, we may want to talk about as a council adopting some sort of a capital, if we're going to do this, a capital policy, reserve policy, because otherwise we have nothing tying our hands. We're going to have $2 million or whatever sitting in the bank, and at any given time, any counselor or the administration is going to be looking at this money, and they're going to want to put it to work. And so what is our guiding principle of why are we sitting on how much money? And so it's a worthy discussion, I think. So.
Yep.
Other questions? Councilor Staley?
Yes, I have a lot of questions. So, Mr. Pritchett, thank you for your responsiveness last year. We had, about this time last year, we had our first budget working session where the council actually got to come forward and put forth some of our ideas about how the money should be budgeted before we had the thing finalized. We are going to be doing that again at the end of this month. I do think there's some confusion with the public, and I've heard from 2 council members in the last 24 hours about a confusion on the video the mayor put out saying he garnered support on this proposal from the council. So apparently what that looks like to him and what I'm hearing from other council members isn't connecting. No one contacted me about how I think this money should be allocated, okay? So I'm not sure. It sounds like the fire station, you heard some kind of talk about that. You said that earlier. But I really have a desire to be more involved with this, especially if the mayor's indicating that we gave input into it, okay? Just for the record on that. And also, for the record, I mean, last year, Councilor Starr and I wanted to put 500,000 more towards pothole repair. So that's an issue where we approached you, and we were told at the time, we don't need this. We're going to be talking about more money being put forth for the police department, for overtime. To me, is the same energy. We did it as a resolution. Now it's coming forth as an ordinance. But again, letting the public know what's our responsibility as council members and what's the administration's responsibility. And I think we're both supposed to be working together to come up with ways of spending the extra revenue or just the regular revenue. And also in that video, there was reference 2 times to market, somehow that you're, what was the word that was used? Because you said it too, market downfall?
Well, I would say market fluctuations, you can call it what you want, but changes in economics going forward.
So when I heard that, and the mayor said it and you said it, and I'm thinking, Sean, that are we talking about your concern that the sales tax, that this whole structure is going to be kind of collapsing a bit? Or are we talking about the bond market that we're invested in, that is going to be jeopardized in a way, the principal on our investment? So, and maybe it's both of those things.
Principal on our investment, I mean, U.S. securities are the safest investment in the world, so that's not, our investment in those assets are not at risk, okay? So I want to make that clear. Just because we have to value them differently at the end of the year is a basis of where interest rates are, has nothing to do, and we hold those investments to maturity. So just because we're marking it up on the books or marking it down on the books, we're required to do that because of accounting principles, but that doesn't mean that we're taking a cash loss or a cash gain. And that's the hard part to understand. We have to market to what we could sell it for on that specific.
When I had this discussion with a banker in the last 2 weeks about this bond, the bond versus a CD just in the private market. And I mean, with a personal, if we're personally investing in a bond, there is a level of risk. And especially if the market comes down, market goes up, bonds can go down. So right now, I think there's kind of a hesitancy of people to be too reckless with their investments personally. So I know our city tries to keep it very conservative.
And we're
right?
statutorily required to do so.
And
we're very limited in what we can.
A CD, yeah, CDs are guaranteed.
Collateralized, but a lot of banks aren't asking for our money from the city because they have to fully collateralize those deposits, which is materially different than if a business goes down and buys a CD or you go down and buy a CD. They're not required to pledge collateralize to support it. As a public entity by law, they have to. It makes it less, they're less in demand to seek the city's deposits from that perspective.
And so we can say to the public with all certainty, we're not investing anything in risky ventures.
Not allowed to.
Okay, good. Now, also, I've heard from some FEMA representatives that they are predicting that we could have catastrophic flooding again this spring. So it's prudent to me to say we're going to prepare for that ahead of time, so that we're getting the sandbag operations in check and everything. So I'm 100% behind that. I wanted to go to the budget bucket page, and that was on page 4. And just under those, what does R&E mean on each one of those?
That's the revenue and the expenses for the fund.
Okay.
Those are from 2019.
Revenue, okay. Where's property tax on here?
Property taxes would flow into the general fund, so they fund operations, but they don't fund infrastructure. So they would things like potholes, maintenance items, they come out of the general fund, not out of the sales tax fund. So property taxes go for things like that. They go for snow removal. They go for city salaries. They go for all of the operations of the city, not for bricks and mortar, major road construction.
And under sales tax, you had the debt service 22%, and that's including what we're paying on the event center and all of that, right?
That is correct. It's a good point. We do pay our debt service, which is typically related to bricks and mortar projects, out of our sales and use tax fund.
So I actually, with your proposal, we could say, as a council, we want to put more money towards paying down the debt
Well,
on the event center. Or you could, on the principal.
not unless it's in a refunding situation. So there's certain provisions as to when you can pay down bonds. So for example, when we bring the Community 2020 bond forward, we'll be looking at refunding some existing bonds that have reached that point in their loan commitment that we're allowed to go back and refund them. But other ones are not in that, may not be in that strategy to do that.
So under enterprise funds, I noticed you didn't mention any debt service on that.
Yes, that would include some debt service related to each of those utilities that carry debt. So for
I
water,
think there's a huge, going to be a huge debt service under reclamation, right? 260 million?
there will be some debt service that is served by those fees, correct?
That'd be nice to have, when you do bring this forward, I'd like to have that included in there.
Okay.
So we can, I mean, if we're talking debt service sales tax, it'd be nice to have the debt, any debt that's owed anywhere, just for apples to apples. Okay, so I'll let that go for now if somebody else wants to ask some questions.
Councilor Brecky?
Actually isn't a question, it's just a statement. I wanted to just add to the discussion regarding Great Bear. Just a little history on that. You know, back when the city undertook that obligation, the understanding there was that that board, you know, had the expertise, a very unique expertise to manage a ski operation, which requires a very, you know, a very technical, a different kind of expertise. But that when the city took it over, it was the understanding that the city was taking it over, the maintenance, you know, the maintenance of it, but that the operation and management of it would be left with the donating company, really. I mean, they actually, there was some exchange of funds, and I think there was actually some donated things that went in place as well. But the maintenance of the facility afterwards was to be the city's responsibility. And then I would just also add, because I happen to be in the position of sitting on the Chamber Appeals Committee, and the Great Bear Board did come to that Chamber Appeals Committee and request that the Chamber Appeals Committee, you know, as part of its annual fund drive, consider replacing, you know, doing some upgrades and replacement out at Great Bear. And the Chamber Appeals Committee did turn them down. And I don't know if you folks even know that, but part of the reason that they turned it down is they've been very reluctant. They're pretty much more about bricks and mortar for nonprofits, so they've been very reluctant to do deals with the city. They've done a couple, the Arboretum, the Sioux Falls Stockyard experience, but mostly they've been very reluctant to create assets on city property. They don't see that as their role. So, and so when they brought this, that discussion really revolved around the city's response. It's just a maintenance responsibility for the city, for a city park, is how the Chamber Appeals Group kind of approached that, and they did get turned down. So I just want to add that I think it was a unique request to ask them, you know, to do it. They did try, but it would be something very difficult for all the reasons that were explained for them to do that. And I do think it is, you know, part of the city's, you know, it's an expensive one, but it's just one of those routine maintenance responsibilities that we have to be responsible for.
Others? Councilor Staley.
Okay, some more questions. Great Bear, and Don, maybe you want to answer this. Just to reference the investment that we do continue to make, was it a $400,000 snowcat groomer that we purchased for them?
I think it's right in the $250,000 range.
I think it was more than that. I think it was $350,000 to $400,000. Anybody else have any numbers on that? So, $350,000. Mr. Rust has, my memory is serving me well, yes. So we are putting investments into this. And do we do a subsidy for them every year?
We do not subsidize, we do not pay them anything.
So they're breaking even on their operational costs?
Most years.
Then what happens on the other years?
They have to figure it out.
Okay, so let me just throw this out. Are we ever offering free, do we offer free and reduced passes like we do with swimming pools?
It's a good question for Dan to be able to address.
Hi, Dan Greider with Great Bear. Counselor, yes, we do, nothing quite as dedicated, I'd say, as the pool passes, but we work with many different organizations. Most recently, George McGovern, the middle school, was out here the last 2 days to go tubing, and we covered all those expenses. You know, we discount various groups. Last weekend, we had our adaptive ski weekend out for our disabled skiers. There again, all that expense was covered by Great Bear.
Yeah, and so this is an interesting discussion about private-public partnerships, isn't it? And sometimes, unfortunately, it comes back on the weight of the taxpayers to help out when it doesn't come through. So in order for me to be more on board with supporting those things, I do need to be able to go back to the public and say, you know, we got this, we're using your tax dollars into this, but we are going to find ways to utilize or to offer the opportunity for more people to use it. So it's not seen as some kind of a private entity. Do you understand what I'm saying? I do, yeah. So I think having even more opportunities for children to be able to ski, the free and reduced situation would be a wonderful direction to go with this.
Yes, and we have actually reached out to some private members of the community to fund such a scholarship program. There's been no headway on that. But yes, that is something.
And just like the pavilion that we're going to be talking to, you know, they used to have free Fridays, and finding ways of bringing the public in to these tax-involved entities, I think is really a benefit.
I would say that probably our best example of that is what we call Fifth Grade Fridays. And for $10 every Friday, any fifth grader, not necessarily just from Sioux Falls, but from anywhere, could come out to Great Bear, lift ticket, rental, lesson, 9 o'clock, they can go tubing all for $10. The retail cost on that would be upwards of $50. That is one of our most popular programs, has been for 6 or 7 years now. Hundreds of kids participate in that, and they make nearly 1,000 visits every year. Friday night at Great Bear is a lot of fun.
Okay, so I would say maybe we can even expand on that a little bit, you know, to get that energy. So that's my 2 cents on that. And then I wanted to talk about Terrace Park, so thank you. Don, we're talking, you're also asking for the 800,000. I'm coming back because this is all park department related. 800,000 for the chairlift, just to say that, again, when we're looking at the whole big picture, we talked a few weeks ago about taking care of the trees on the boulevard for all of our citizens, coming out of the park department's budget. And so now we're talking 800,000 for the chairlift, and they were proposing that after the initial expenditure of about 1.8 million, it was going to be about 650,000 a year to take care of the trees on our boulevard. And again, it's talking about priorities, you know, what will help all the people in our community. So I'm just going to continue to bring this up because I think it's important. I think we can do it. I think we can take care of those trees if we have the desire to do that kind of a thing. But back to the Terrace Park issue, I was involved in 2016 when we were talking about the steps, ADA, ramps, taking out the historical steps, and we pulled away from it. Where are we at with that?
We actually are going to revisit that master plan as part of this year's capital program, to revisit that and have continued dialogue and discussion about it.
Well, and to have maybe it can be a win-win for both parts, right? But right now, there's no ramp area. I mean, how does someone with a disability get around? Can they get up? Are there are there,
Yeah, that's obviously one of the challenges with the discussion is about accessibility because of the nature of the terrain in Terrace Park. And so that'll all be on the table, and we'll talk about that some more.
and it goes back to, and Counselor Neisert was with me at that meeting with the Board of Preservation. After we got elected, I mean, the importance, and Kelby was there, the importance of listening to the neighbors as we're going through these projects that are just in the heart of their area. So that's a good thing. Thank you. And then if I can ask one more, Mr. Mark Cotter. Mark, I noticed this as I was watching the video that the mayor put out on YouTube today, and you're talking about this, adding these 800 blocks in. It's great. People are very much behind that kind of effort. But I noticed, and you made a reference that these were like average neighborhoods when you showed the video just now. And I'm looking at those homes and I'm thinking, well, that's really not in my neighborhood. Okay, the streets that you chose. So my question is, how many of those streets that you're looking at, you're talking about keeping the good ones good, but we've had that conversation about the worst ones. And I'll never forget, because we hired those guys to come around, drive all over town to survey our streets. They've been here 2 times now, right?
Yes.
And they said to us at that first summer, I think it was 2016, they said, don't do the worst first. Remember?
Right, that's still our philosophy.
Yes, don't do worst first. So I think those people who might be living in the core neighborhoods whose streets are the worst are probably saying, gee, we're not going to be first, but when are we going to be serviced? So I'm just putting it back on you to say, can we include some more of them in the projects? Because what you showed as what we're going to be doing, those homes look like they were not the worst. And they were like high-end homes that we're going to be servicing. So I would have been happy to see you showing some of the more lower-end homes with the streets that are cracking up.
To be honest, when you're trying to capture it from a drone video to show the process, there's just less tree canopy in that neighborhood that we've shown. But I think you've asked for that map in the past. Where have we been for the last, in the previous, to show what our investment's been in the core, and it's been substantial. Had a good conversation with Councilor Sale today. He asked for that same information. So I could certainly do a 5-year and a 10-year look back so you can see that we've prioritized road projects through and across the city. That video is only captured so we could show a neighborhood without much tree canopy so you could actually see the process, not indicative of where we're actually targeting those investments.
And probably a lot of those homes are in Councilor Sale's district, right? The ones of the core areas, the older homes.
Yeah, we've done, last year was a substantial amount of blocks that we did in the core area. But I won't have it for tonight, but certainly for second reading, if you'd like me to bring that. That was a request that Councilor Sale had. I can certainly bring some of that information to second reading.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is a great conversation, and I'd like to continue, but we do have to start public input at 5:45. We have one more heavy presentation to come, plus we have the executive session, which is why we have to do public input. So unless there's objection, I'm going to move on to the next item. We can talk about this more at the first reading, unless somebody wants to make has another suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, I would object just because this has been brought to us at the last minute and we have to vote on it tonight, and they're expecting us to make at least a decision for second reading. I'll gladly move on and not object, but this is what happens when this stuff is thrown on us at the last minute. We can't ask the appropriate questions that we'd like to do. The administration's dumped this on us now at the last minute so that we can vote on it the same day. We all have in the past, if we talk about what happens at the dais and the discussion that we have here, it is objectionable to ask us to vote on things and do an informational in the same day in a matter of a couple of hours. And especially when the information's only shared via the media, and that's when we learn about it in the first time. So I understand that we've asked other people to be here, and I respect that. And I know that the executive session is an important part of where we go today. But I'm expressing my displeasure with the administration and the mayor of dumping this on us and expecting us to be able to move forward with this tonight. And that will at least be in a point where I'll have some kind of deferral motion tonight, at least for when we do second reading.
I'm going to follow the direction of the council. I'm completely open. I'm looking for any consensus or guidance. Move on to the next item or stick with this?
If I may?
Yes, Mr. Kiley, Chair Kiley.
Thank you. Well, I haven't had the opportunity to speak here this afternoon. I fully intended to, but I can wait until the first reading this evening, and I do know the challenges involved with staying on schedule. So I'm fine with moving forward with the next item.
One question I would have, this is a really heavy item, this next one coming up, and there's only 10 minutes. Would there be an opportunity, whoever's presenting might want to let us know, Scott, would you have some input as to whether we should even take this tonight yet, or if we need to make an adjustment? Because I don't think we're going to get through it in 10 minutes.
It's on first reading as well.
It's only first reading tonight, so we could put it off another week. Is that all right with you guys? Come back next week?
Is it a first reading or is it a consent agenda item?
No, it's a first reading tonight.
It's a resolution.
Would you be agreeable to? Would you be agreeable to rescheduling?
We could, yeah, I think we could reschedule if it's all right with Art Gink.
I don't want to inconvenience you, but I don't think you're going to get it done in 8 minutes.
Probably not.
So I want to do justice to the time that you'll need. So if you're agreeable to that.
Yeah, and I can cover a few things tonight, first reading too.
Okay. I think the council's just going to have to make a decision about what we want to do, but obviously we'll just potentially just have to defer that. Okay. So would the council just like to continue with the current item that we're on? Because we have to take public input in 8 minutes, but we do have 8 minutes if we're just going to just defer on this item. Other questions on this particular capital item? Thank you. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I just don't want to rush you because this is going to be a big
Mr. Chair?
item. So. Yes.
I'm wondering if it's not, since it's going to go forward to first reading, I was a little confused as whether we were deferring informational and first reading, or if we're deferring just the informational and retaining the first reading for this evening. But anyway, I was going to say, I think it would be valuable to give them an opportunity to use whatever time's available now, and then we'll just have further discussion this evening.
I think it's going to be an important topic. We're not hard pressed on time frame for this, so if it means deferring it for a week and Art Gink is available for that, then we just request maybe the council defer it from tonight, first reading, before we even take it to first reading, because I think it's helpful for you to have this informational before then on that particular topic, and it's not time sensitive, so we've got.
Okay, so no problem with deferring the first reading this evening?
Not for the Washington Pavilion, no.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I would concur that we defer this very important topic till next week, and we'll make the appropriate motion tonight to defer first reading.
Okay, sounds good. Other questions on the current item that we're still on, sales tax update?
I'm good. I think Councilor Kiley.
I just had, mine are more comments than questions, so if you have questions, Councilor, go forward.
Good.
Then I will go forward. Thank you. First of all, I do appreciate the depth of the conversation that we've had this afternoon from my colleagues in the council, as well as the responses from the administration, from the directors. I do like being fiscally conservative, so I'm certainly not opposed to the 1.7 million reserve funds as it relates to sales and use tax fund. I do think, I agree with Councilor Neisert that maybe that's a topic that should be discussed further among this group as to where we want to set that level at. I think the challenge, though, and maybe Director Pritchett, you could chime in too if you wish. I think the challenge with that is this is very dependent on futures, what may or may not happen. And so, what's suitable for a reserve during this time frame might be actually too high down the road for another time. Because I've often mentioned with our general fund reserves, when it gets well over that 25%, we're sitting on taxpayer dollars and we're not putting it to use as maybe taxpayers had hoped it would be or intended it to be. So I guess that would be, my only concern, that if we do set a policy, that we are reasonable in what we do set, but it's probably something that needs to be discussed further. But I'm certainly okay with being fiscally conservative. I preach that to my kids all the time. My parents preach it to me in terms of budgeting, and I would expect that we do the same as a city. The fire and rescue station number 12, which will be located out in my district, is something that I've been advocating for 6 years now that I've been on the council, actually with the previous administration. And now the timing is absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely necessary that we move forward. Because with the building of the Ben Rifle Middle School, this will be located right across the street. And with Ben Rifle Middle School, that area is just going to, as we've seen in other areas, that the development with housing is just going to explode. And so our services, I think, are already getting to the point where they're stretched. So the ability to get that scheduled right away, where we don't have to make it dependent on what's going to happen with the bond, I think that's important. And also, paying cash instead of bonding for it, I think there's a savings right there. If we have that ability, we should, and I believe that's a win-win. And I know that it's been kind of on and off and on again, so I'm very happy to see that we are going to be using some of this surplus for that purpose. The highways and streets, I mean, that's, with our citizen survey, that's always one of the, that's usually the #1 topic of discussion or concerns among our citizens. So investing an additional $1.7 million, I think is a good thing to do and very reasonable. We actually did that this year and took some of the money from Director Kearney's Park and Rec Department in order to invest more in our streets and infrastructure. So I'm fine with doing that, and I do leave it to Director Cotter to make the determination of where we can get the biggest savings for. Because I do know that if we wait too long, the cost of repair just escalates and you get less for your investment as a result. So whether it's 41st Street or some other street, I'm in favor of making the investments there because, quite frankly, our citizens expect that and want to see that improvement in our road conditions. With the parks and recreation, I'm happy that we can put a little over 1.1 million back into parks after we've taken from parks to, as I mentioned, to focus on other areas that are of higher priority. I know how valuable the park and rec system was to me as a child growing up in this city. And again, my father worked at John Morrell. My mom stayed at home to take care of my sister who had disabilities. And so the park and rec was something that we could do with very little investment from the Kiley family. And it was something that I reaped big returns. And it's remains my commitment as a counselor to see to it that other individuals, not only children, but young adults and adults can reap those benefits as I did too. So the Great Bear chairlift situation, I understand the difficulty it is to fundraise. I mean, this is a giving community, but we're somewhat limited with that big pot that exists out there. And we have a lot of different organizations going to that all the time. And when it comes down to recreational activities in the winter, there's few outdoor venues that our citizens, especially our youth, can choose to participate in. And I would would wager, this is just a guess on my part, is it basically 25 and under the high use individuals out there? And these are the people that we want to get involved in healthy activities versus maybe some of the other things that they can get into when they have a lot of idle time. So I'm all for that. The Lions Den, that's been around. I remember when lions were in there. I stuck my head up to the window, and a lion actually growled back at me when somebody challenged me to do so. There were really lions in the basement of that building at one point in time. So fortunately, and now I do have a question regarding that, so maybe Don, is that as well as the gardens, are they on the National Register of Historic Places?
Yes, they both are.
Okay, thank you. So even more important that we do address those issues in a timely and prudent fashion, because you hate to see, it is a little disheartening to see the amount of deterioration that's already taken place out there, especially to the gardens. So I know that there's never a lack of places to put the money, and we could always debate about other places that might be more appropriate, and that's what we're doing here this evening. But I do see the value in what's been brought forward here this afternoon, and actually which was made available to us at some point last week. I probably ate up our 8 minutes. Sorry.
Yes, you did. You
really
did.
not.
You did, Councilor Kiley. It's perfect timing. I do apologize. I'm sure this will continue to be a spirited discussion tonight. We do need to move on to public input. Public input, we would welcome anybody that wants to talk about any item we covered today. 5 minutes per speaker, 15 minutes. Anybody that would like to take up the opportunity for public input tonight? Seeing none, I will look for a motion.
Or move to, move into executive session, preparing for contract negotiations and negotiating with employees or employee representatives pursuant to South Dakota Codified Law 125-2-4. Second that.
Second, Brecky.
Seconded by Brecky, moved by Kiley. Roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Brecky?
Yes.
Erickson? Kiley?
Yes.
Nitzert?
Yes.
Berg? Sale?
Yes.
Starr? Staley?
Yes.